Imagine yourself on a hilltop in Galilee over 2,000 years ago. In front of you is a man who will change the world with his words. He's not a powerful politician or a famous philosopher. He's Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God, about to deliver the most revolutionary speech in history, the Sermon on the Mount, also known as the ethics of God's kingdom, a code of conduct all Christians should follow. But what makes this sermon so special? Why are we still discussing it 2,000 years later? Get ready for a journey that will forever change your perspective. In the next few minutes, we will explore the deepest teachings ever given. Teachings that challenged empires, transformed hearts, and remain as relevant today as when they were first spoken. The Beatitudes are Christ's guide to achieving happiness. This sermon will change everything you thought you knew about success and happiness. You might be wondering, why should I care about a speech given over 2,000 years ago? That's a fair and honest question. So let me explain why the Sermon on the Mount is not just an ancient discourse, but a manual for anyone who wants to live a happy and fulfilling life. Imagine a world where forgiveness replaces revenge, where compassion overcomes selfishness, and where love triumphs over hate. It might seem like an impossible dream, but this is exactly the vision Jesus presented in the Sermon on the Mount. He not only shared this vision, but also provided the tools to make it a reality. In a world fractured by conflicts, divisions, and hate, the teachings of this sermon offer a radical alternative, a way of life that can mend broken relationships, bring peace to desperate situations, and transform entire communities. These aren't just theoretical ideas. They are practical principles with the power to change lives. Throughout history, countless lives have been touched by these words. Jesus wasn't just teaching, he was challenging the entire value system of his time and ours. He was introducing a completely new way of relating to one another and to God. Picture the scene. A diverse crowd gathered eagerly, with Jesus sitting like a teacher, ready to share truths that would change the world. The sermon begins with the Beatitudes, a series of statements that start with blessed or happy. Let's delve into the heart of the Sermon on the Mount. It begins in Matthew chapter 5, verse 1. And seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 5:3. Wait, poor in spirit? That goes against everything society tells us about success and happiness. It's not about material poverty, but the spiritual bankruptcy of our need for God's help and salvation. Admitting that we don't have all the answers and recognizing our dependence on God is the first step to experiencing the kingdom of heaven, not in some distant future, but here and now. Jesus continues, Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Matthew 5:4. In a world that insists we should always be happy and quickly move on from our losses, Jesus acknowledges our pain. He tells us that it's okay to grieve, that mourning is a natural part of life, and he promises comfort. This isn't an invitation to pessimism, but a recognition that pain is part of the human experience and that God is with us in our suffering. As we move through the Beatitudes, we encounter another powerful statement. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Matthew 5:5. Hold on, meek, they will inherit the earth? In a world that glorifies the aggressive and the assertive, this seems absurd. Yet Jesus is directly challenging the survival of the fittest mentality. Meekness isn't weakness. Meekness is having self-control. It's having self-discipline, the ability to respond with love even when faced with mistreatment. Because you cannot give others the power to take away your happiness and peace of mind. Meekness is having the power to retaliate but choosing not to, just as Jesus did when he was crucified. Then Jesus continues, Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Matthew 5:6. He's not talking about physical hunger and thirst, but this metaphor means that righteousness isn't something we can achieve through our own efforts, because only God provides the righteousness we hunger and thirst for. This is a call to action, not just a hope for change, but an active effort to create a more just world. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He continues, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." Matthew 5:7. In a world that often demands revenge and takes pleasure in seeing the mighty fall, Jesus calls us to choose compassion. Mercy isn't just an emotion, it's an action. It's choosing to forgive, even when we feel justified in holding a grudge. And Jesus continues, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Matthew 5:8. This goes beyond outward appearances. Jesus is talking about inner integrity, about being the same person in both public and private. It's a call to authenticity in a world full of masks and pretense. As we continue through the Sermon on the Mount, we encounter one of Jesus' most challenging teachings. You have heard that it was said, "An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Matthew 5:38-39. Wait, does this mean Jesus is telling us to be weak and let others walk all over us? What Jesus proposes here is nothing less than a revolution in human relationships. In the culture of that time, and even in ours, revenge is often expected. If someone wrongs you, you're expected to pay them back in kind, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But Jesus says to stop, there's a better way. Turning the other cheek doesn't mean being passive. It means choosing not to repay evil with evil. It's about breaking the cycle of violence and revenge, sending a message that says, your act of violence stops with me, I won't continue it. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He goes even further, saying, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who mistreat you and persecute you. Matthew 5:44. This might be the most radical command of all. It goes against every natural instinct we have. Love our enemies and bless those who curse us. Jesus is absolutely serious, and he explains why we should do this. That you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. Matthew 5:45. Now let's dive into another compelling part of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus addresses something we all struggle with, judging others. He says, do not judge, or you too will be judged. Matthew 7:1. Jesus is warning against hypocritical and arrogant judgment. He illustrates this with a humorous image. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not notice the plank in your own eye? Matthew 7:3. Imagine someone with a huge log sticking out of their eye, trying to remove a tiny speck from someone else's eye. It's ridiculous, and that's exactly Jesus' point. He uses humor to highlight the absurdity of judging others without first examining ourselves. The lesson isn't to ignore others' faults, but to start with self-examination, approaching others with humility and compassion rather than moral superiority. Now let's turn our attention to a part of the Sermon on the Mount that is especially relevant today: anxiety. In Matthew 6:25, Jesus advises, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Before assuming that Jesus is advocating irresponsibility, it's important to clarify that he is not suggesting we shouldn't plan or work. Instead, he is addressing the overwhelming anxiety that can take over our lives. To make his point, Jesus uses beautiful examples from nature, like the birds of the air, which don't worry about the future, yet they are provided for. They don't sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Matthew 6:26. And about clothes, why do you worry? See how the lilies of the field grow. They do not labor or spin, yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. Matthew 6:28-29. Jesus is not advocating passivity. He is inviting us to trust in a loving Father who cares for us even more than he does for the birds and the flowers. He challenges our tendency to believe that everything depends solely on our efforts, Then comes the key message, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Matthew 6:33. This represents a profound shift in priorities. Jesus urges us to put God first, to seek his will and righteousness, and to trust that our needs will be met. Now let's explore one of the most challenging aspects of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus addresses a difficult issue. Every day, we are confronted with choices about our priorities and our relationship with material goods. Jesus advises, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal." He challenges us to reflect on what we truly value and where we are investing our lives. Take a moment to consider how often we find ourselves chasing after the next exciting thing, a new phone, a stylish car, or the latest fashion trend. While there's nothing wrong with enjoying these things, Jesus invites us to look deeper. He then makes a powerful statement, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Matthew 6:21. This profound truth reminds us that what we value deeply influences who we become. Priorities aren't just about what we do, they're about who we become. Then Jesus presents a final challenge. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Matthew 6:24. Jesus is not condemning money itself, but he warns that an obsession with wealth and material things can easily take over our lives, becoming a dominant force that shapes our decisions and guides our path. When that happens, there's little room left for God. Now let's move on to one of the most well-known parts of the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord's Prayer. And this is how Jesus begins. "This, then, is how you should pray, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name." Matthew 6:9. Pause for a moment and consider how revolutionary this was. In that cultural context, God was often seen as distant and formidable. But here, Jesus teaches us to approach God as a loving Father, which changes everything.
"Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." This phrase isn't just a beautiful part of the prayer, it's a deep commitment. We are declaring our desire for God's will, not ours, to be done, and for his way of doing things to take precedence in our lives and in the world. Then Jesus instructs us to pray for our daily needs. "Give us today our daily bread." Notice the phrase, it's our bread, not my bread. Even when asking for basic needs, Jesus reminds us of our connection to a larger community. And it's a daily request, emphasizing the importance of trusting God every day, rather than hoarding out of anxiety. "And forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors." This is challenging, isn't it? Jesus directly links the forgiveness we receive to the forgiveness we extend to others, making it clear that we cannot expect to experience God's forgiveness if we refuse to forgive others. And finally, Jesus teaches us, "And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one." Matthew 6:13. Jesus acknowledges that life is full of challenges, including temptations and difficulties. He teaches us to trust in God for protection and deliverance. This prayer, though simple, touches on multiple aspects of our lives. It serves as a guide not just on how to pray, but also on how to live. We often think that everything rests on our shoulders, but then Jesus delivers a powerful message. "But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." Matthew 6:33. This is a profound shift in priorities. Jesus is telling us to put God at the center, to seek his will and his righteousness, trusting that he will provide for our needs. It's not a promise of wealth or a life free of challenges, but an invitation to live with an eternal perspective, trusting in a God who loves and cares for us. As we near the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus concludes with a striking analogy. "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. Matthew 7:24-25.
This powerful image illustrates the strength of Jesus' teachings.
He emphasizes that his words provide a solid foundation that can withstand the storms of life. Living according to Jesus' teachings provides us with the stability and strength needed to face life's storms. However, notice that Jesus doesn't say, "Everyone who hears these words of mine and agrees with them," or "everyone who memorizes these words of mine." Instead, he says, "Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice."
The focus is on action, on applying his teachings in our lives.
Jesus then presents a contrasting scenario. "But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash." Matthew 7:24-27. The message is clear. Simply hearing or knowing Jesus' teachings is not enough. We must live them, applying them in our daily choices, relationships, and decisions. It's important to note that in both situations, the storm comes. Jesus doesn't promise a life free from challenges for those who follow his teachings. The difference lies in our ability to remain standing amid life's storms. This powerful conclusion to the Sermon on the Mount emphasizes that true strength comes from living his words, not just hearing them. The Sermon on the Mount challenges us to go beyond merely listening to its teachings. It urges us to live them out, allowing these principles to shape our identity and actions. As we conclude our reflection on this powerful sermon, we're reminded of how it began with the Beatitudes, which transformed our understanding of happiness and success. We've explored lessons on forgiveness, loving our enemies, prayer, judgment, anxiety, and much more.
Now, the real question is how we will apply these teachings to our lives.
The challenge is before us, and the decision is ours. We must not only listen, but also put these teachings into practice, moving from knowledge to action. This is where the true transformative power of the Sermon on the Mount lies. It's not just a list of rules or moral guidelines. It's an invitation to embrace a radically different way of life, a call to a transformation of our lives. Reflect on the stark contrast between Jesus' teachings and the values embraced by the world around us. While the world advocates an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, Jesus instructs us to turn the other cheek. The world tells us to love our friends and hate our enemies, but Jesus calls us to love our enemies. Where the world encourages us to accumulate wealth, Jesus urges us to store up treasures in heaven. It's as if Jesus is presenting a radically different way of life, one that may seem strange or even foolish to the world, but that is the path to true life, genuine freedom, and lasting peace.
However, make no mistake, living this way is not easy.
It requires daily effort to go against the current, to choose love over hate, forgiveness over revenge, and generosity over selfishness. Yet Jesus assures us that this challenging path leads to an abundant life. He says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." These verses from Matthew 7:13-14 encapsulate the central message of the Sermon on the Mount, that the best path is not always the easiest, but it certainly brings the best results. It's a call to a different, transformative life that leads to salvation and eternal life. But how do we apply these teachings to our daily lives? Let's take, for example, Jesus' command to love our enemies. In Matthew 5:44, he tells us to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. At first glance, this seems impossible. How can we love those who oppose us or harm us? But what if we started with small steps? Imagine the next time someone cuts you off in traffic. Instead of responding with anger or a rude gesture, say a quick prayer for them. Lord, bless that driver. Maybe they're having a tough day. Or consider the workplace, where you may have a colleague who seems intent on making things difficult for you.
Instead of retaliating, what if you chose to do something kind for them?
You could simply greet them with a genuine smile. Jesus isn't asking us to tolerate bad behavior. Instead, he calls us to respond to negativity with kindness, breaking the cycle of hatred and retaliation. Regarding his teaching on not judging others, this doesn't mean we shouldn't distinguish between right and wrong, but rather that we should approach others with humility and compassion, understanding that everyone has their own flaws. The next time you feel tempted to harshly judge someone, pause and consider what may have led them to act that way. How would you behave if you were in their shoes? This shift in perspective can transform how we see and treat others. Now let's address something we all deal with, worry and anxiety. Jesus advises us not to worry about tomorrow, for each day has enough trouble of its own. Matthew 6:34. This doesn't mean we shouldn't plan for the future. Planning for the future is important, but we shouldn't let worries about what's to come steal our peace in the present. Instead, Jesus invites us to live one day at a time, trusting that God will provide for us.
How can we apply this to our daily lives?
A good start could be beginning each day with a moment of gratitude. Before you even get out of bed, think of 3 things you're grateful for. This practice can set a positive tone for the day and remind us of the blessings we already have. When anxiety strikes, and it will try this exercise, pause, take a deep breath and ask yourself, what am I worried about? Is it something I can control? If it is, make an action plan. If not, offer it to God in prayer. Remember Jesus' words. Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Matthew 6:26. Let this truth settle in your heart. You're valued, loved, and cared for. As for prayer, Jesus gave us the Lord's Prayer as a model. How about incorporating it into your daily life? Make prayer a part of your daily routine, not just by reciting the words, but by deeply reflecting on each phrase. For example, when you say, Our Father, remember that you have a loving Heavenly Father who cares for you. When you pray, Your kingdom come, commit yourself to live today according to the values of God's kingdom. And when you say, Give us this day our daily bread, put your trust in God to meet your needs. Now let's talk about temptation. Jesus addresses this in the Sermon on the Mount with striking and uncomfortable imagery. He says, if your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. Is Jesus literally telling us to remove our eyes? No, he is using hyperbole and intentional exaggeration to emphasize a crucial point. We must take sin seriously and be willing to take drastic measures to avoid it. So how can we apply this in our daily lives? Consider the things that often lead you into temptation. It could be certain websites, TV shows, or perhaps certain people or places. Jesus is urging us to be radical in dealing with these sources of temptation. If certain websites are a source of temptation, consider installing a blocker. If certain people consistently have a negative influence on you, it might be time to reevaluate those friendships. This isn't easy. It may require sacrifice and giving up things you enjoy. But Jesus is telling us that it's worth it. He's saying that our spiritual purity and moral integrity are far more valuable than any temporary pleasure sin may offer. And remember, we're not fighting this battle alone. Jesus taught us to pray, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Matthew 6:13. We can and should seek God's help in resisting temptation. Now let's discuss something we all do daily, talking. Jesus has a lot to say about our words in the Sermon on the Mount. He warns, I tell you that on the day of judgment, men will give account for every careless word they speak. Matthew 12:36. This perspective sheds new light on our everyday conversations. Isn't Jesus highlighting the power and significance of our words? Our words are not just sounds. They carry the power to build up or tear down, to heal or to harm. So how can we put this understanding into practice in our daily lives? Consider doing a gossip fast for a week. Challenge yourself not to speak negatively about anyone, even in a joking or seemingly harmless way. Instead, focus on using your words to uplift, and encourage others. Jesus also addresses the issue of oaths in the Sermon on the Mount, saying, "But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all. Let your yes be yes, and your no, no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one." Matthew 5:34-37.
The essence of this teaching is about the integrity of our words. Jesus is urging us to be people of our word, so trustworthy that we don't need to back up our promises with oaths.
Practically, this means doing what you say you will do, being honest even when it's challenging, and admitting when you're wrong, rather than trying to cover up the mistake with more words.
Remember, our words are a reflection of what is in our hearts. Jesus teaches, "For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of," Matthew 12:34.
Therefore, nurturing a heart full of love, compassion, and truth is essential for communication that honors God and blesses others.
Now let's address a common behavior that often goes unnoticed: judging others.
Jesus speaks strongly about this in the Sermon on the Mount, saying, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." Matthew 7:1-2.
At first glance, it might seem like Jesus is telling us never to make moral judgments.
However, his warning is actually about hypocritical judgment, the tendency to point out the faults of others while ignoring our own.
So how can we apply this lesson in our daily lives? Here are some practical tips.
Practice self-reflection. Before pointing out someone else's mistakes, take a moment to examine your own heart. Ask yourself, am I guilty of the same error or something similar? Cultivate empathy. When you find yourself judging someone, try putting yourself in their shoes.
Consider what circumstances might have led to their behavior.
Remember your own need for grace. We all make mistakes and need forgiveness.
Let this understanding make you more compassionate toward others.
Approaching others with humility and love is key. The goal is not to condemn but to restore.
Psychologists refer to this as compassionate curiosity. Instead of judging, ask yourself, what might this person be going through and how can I help? Jesus isn't telling us to ignore the difference between right and wrong.
Instead, he is encouraging us to approach others and ourselves with humility, compassion, and grace. If you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel to keep receiving our content. Thank you, and God bless you.